Hello, this is Harold Halftan, and welcome to Archaeological Minecraft. I'm a former archaeologist who enjoys playing Minecraft and thought it'd be fun to combine the two. In today's episode, we're back on the Archaeo SMP, and we're continuing to develop the Iron Age area of my base with more Carthaginian builds as we work our way forward in time towards the Visigothic villa, which dates to the early medieval period. In this Iron Age area of my base, we're looking at the ancient city of Carthage, the great ancient rival of Rome, and specifically the area of the city called Massouda, which was continuously occupied from the city's founding in around 814 BC for the next 1400 years to around 700 AD. In the last episode, we looked at a series of builds that were close to that founding date and worked our way through the Archaic period, recreating how the dwellings on an exact plot of land changed in around 760 BC to around 725 BC and then to around 675 BC. So those are those three houses behind me here. From there, this dwelling from around 675 BC remained the same for the next 500 years. So we'll have to leave our plot of land from last episode and jump to what we built before that, a cremation necropolis that was around 100 meters or around 300 feet south of these dwellings. Now, this cremation necropolis dates to around 800 BC, so very close to the founding of the city. So what happened in this area where that cremation necropolis was? In this area of Massouda, some of the cremation necropolis looks like it was moved in order to make room for an ironworking industrial area. Now, this industrial area was pretty huge and covered an area of around 1,500 square meters. To say that differently, that's an area of 1.5 square kilometers, or around 18 city blocks. So yeah, pretty huge. In an industrial district, to produce iron of that scale says something else. And that's that they were producing a tremendous amount of iron, obviously. Based on the archaeology of this time, it seems that Carthage might have been the principal location that iron was produced in North Africa, and some articles I read suggested that perhaps it was the Carthaginians themselves who were the principal introducers of iron into North Africa. So here we see evidence of the Carthaginian trade networks for which they were so famous, and which helped fuel their massive economy, which grew their empire to rival that of ancient Rome. It also speaks to the connections that they had with their homeland around the city of Tyre and the wider Phoenician world, as the iron they smelted was traded not just locally in North Africa and the Western Mediterranean, but also through Tyre and the other Phoenician cities to places like Assyria. Archaeologically, this metalworking area found traces of furnaces, loads of slag, and bellows pipes. Slag is the remains or the waste of iron production, and one thing that's interesting about the iron waste here is that from the 6th to the 5th centuries BC, so basically the centuries after this last domestic house we built last episode was constructed, this waste showed something special and perhaps pretty unique, which points to what made this iron-producing industrial district so phenomenal. This iron waste showed large amounts of chalk. Now, I know what you're thinking. So what? I thought you just said this waste was special, and chalk doesn't seem very special. Well, here's the thing. The raw minerals and rock that you use to extract iron from in their natural states often contain sulfur, which is an element that makes iron brittle, basically weakening the iron and making it more likely to fracture, which is not often a quality you want in your iron. And remember, we're talking about iron here, not steel. Steel's something that comes around much, much later. So back to the sulfur. How did ancient people work around this and fix the fact that they had sulfured iron, which would make their iron brittle? Well, they had to take that iron ore after it was produced and then roast it in what's called roasting furnaces. These roasting furnaces would heat up the iron ore to being red hot while air was being added into it. That would help drive out the sulfur, thus making the iron less brittle before they could forge it into whatever it is they were going to make out of it. That was the method used throughout the Mediterranean. It meant that to make good iron was very expensive because you not only had to create the iron, but you had to add a whole nother step, which was costly for all the fuel it would use to reheat up the iron. What the Carthaginians figured out and what the high chalk levels showed is that they processed their iron to remove the sulfur using a different method. By adding chalk, or essentially calcium carbonate, into the process where they extracted the iron from the natural minerals from the start, the calcium binds to the sulfur, helping neutralize it from the beginning. So basically, by adding chalk, the Carthaginians could produce high quality iron more consistently and more cheaply than others around the Mediterranean. at this time. Incidentally, the other cool thing about this process of adding chalk in this way is that after the Carthaginians, it was lost to time and basically forgotten by humanity. It wasn't until 1855 that the method was rediscovered and patented and once again put back into practice. Beyond the iron found in this industrial district, there was a high quantity of crushed murex shells found in the area. Those are the shells from a specific kind of mollusk that was used in ancient times to produce a rare and expensive purple dye. Now, in the last episode, I mentioned that the name of the city of Carthage simply means new city in Phoenician, but the name Phoenicia is Greek, which means the land of purple, and is named after the Phoenicians' most famous exported good, i.e. purple dye. So it's no surprise then that Carthage, being a Phoenician colony, exported not just high-quality iron, which they were seemingly so adept at, but they also produced and exported the famous purple dye. How this purple dye was made is that the mollusks were collected, the purple producing organ was taken out of the mollusk and then placed with some brine and then heated for about 10 days until the liquid was the desired purplish color. According to Pliny the Elder, a Roman author who lived from about AD 23 to AD 79 and died in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius at Pompeii, it took thousands of these mollusks to produce a single ounce of dye. Okay, so you've been watching me build these little ironworks and purple dye producing areas, so let me walk you through them now that they're all done. Starting first with the purple dye, I mocked this up in different ways, showing how the dye would have been heated, as I described, and then at that point fabric could have been dipped in and then allowed to dry and then could be sold in the market or transported somewhere. Moving over to the ironworks, regarding the bellows and pipes, which were found archaeologically, the bellows would have been made of animal skins, often from a young goat. It was connected to a bellows pipe that were made of heavy tempered clay and interconnected the bellows to the furnace. There were 2 bellows and 2 bellows pipes then connected to the furnaces, one on either end, so even more air could be forced into the furnace, enabling even hotter temperatures to be achieved. In my recreation, I used these lightning rods to approximate the bellows pipes and these shulkers to approximate the bellows. See, I like how these things go up and down, just like real bellows. Now, as for the forge themselves, I couldn't find an exact description of what they looked like, and so I mocked them up in a couple of different ways based on what was described. Some descriptions described a clay forge that would have had charcoal in the back and had oxygen-deprived space with forced air injections, as I described. So imagine an oven where you would force in air to keep the fire as hot as possible. I'm popping up on screen a diagram of a similar furnace, which was from the Roman period later than this and used in Britain. Another way this iron furnace was described was more of an enclosed fire pit, where you had a central fire with charcoal encircled by a forge wall with bellows going through the forge wall. Here's an Egyptian image of what that might have looked like, and you can see in this picture how there's a central fire and then a person on either side stoking the fire using bellows that are attached to their feet as if they're walking in place, and that lets the air in and out as they push their foot back with the soles of their feet, providing the seal that would keep the air from leaking out of the bellows and forces the air into the fire. Now, while Carthage, as I've discussed, was very much aided in the first few hundred years by being able to export this high-quality iron in Massouda, that wasn't to last, and by around 425 to 400 BC or so, iron production had completely halted in Massouda. Other areas of Carthage still produced a small amount of iron, but not in the area we're recreating here. Now, we're going to jump forward in time a little bit for this next build, and while I build this next structure, let me tell you the tale of Carthage's conflict and eventual downfall at the hands of Rome. Carthage, as we talked about, had a thriving economy and trade network, allowing them to ultimately expand their influence over much of the Western Mediterranean, such as the Balearic Islands, Sardinia, Corsica, Spain, and much of Sicily. It was in Sicily that the First Punic War was waged, which took place from around 264 to 241 BC. The First Punic War began as a dispute over control of Sicily, particularly the city of Messina in the northeast of the island. I talked more in depth about this conflict in my episode where I built the 2 triremes and the Carthaginian quadreme, but in summary, Rome was eager to expand its influence, so intervened in Sicilian affairs and clashed with Carthage. Carthage had the superior navy, and Rome had the superior army, at least initially. But Rome built a fleet from scratch and innovated with the corvus, a boarding device that allowed them to turn sea battles into infantry battles. In the end, Rome emerged victorious and gained control of Sicily, which became a Roman province. After the war, Carthage was much diminished and had to, for a time, deal with internal conflicts, allowing Rome to take more of its territory, namely Corsica and Sardinia. Once Carthage solidified its internal position, it made more headway in Spain under its general Hamilcar Barca and his son Hannibal Barca. The Second Punic War, which took place from 218 to 201 BC, was the most famous of the three Punic Wars, and likely the one you've heard of previously. Hannibal, who hated Rome with a burning passion, attacked an ally of Rome in Spain, prompting the declaration of war from Rome onto Carthage. Hannibal raised an army and crossed the Alps with his army, including war elephants, and then spent the next decade defeating Rome in battle after battle as he traveled up and down the Italian peninsula, trying to get Rome's Italian allies to change sides and switch their allegiance over to Carthage, but to no avail. Ultimately, unable to ever defeat Hannibal in battle, Rome adopted Hannibal's strategy and waged war on Carthage in Spain, and eventually taking the fight to North Africa under the general Scipio Africanus. In 202 BC, Scipio defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Zama, ending the war. Carthage lost its empire and was forced to pay a staggering sum of gold, much more than Rome ever thought it could afford to pay back, and it was forbidden from waging wars without Rome's approval. The Third Punic War lasted from 149 to 146 BC and was really just the siege of Carthage. It was spawned by the jealousy and paranoia some in Rome had, who were worried that they didn't completely wipe out Carthage in the Second Punic War, and that eventually, given enough time, they would get strong enough to rival Rome again. Cato the Elder, a Roman senator, had visited the city and was so amazed by the richness of Carthage and its vibrancy of trade that was occurring that he ended every single speech in the Roman Senate by saying, "Carthage must be destroyed." It also didn't hurt his case that indeed Carthage had become increasingly wealthy, being able to pay back the staggering sum of gold penalty that Rome had put on them a full decade earlier than they were supposed to. Rome found its excuse to wage war when one of Carthage's neighbors, the Numidians, took some of Carthage's land by force. Carthage asked Rome for permission to wage war on the Numidians to get it back, but were rebuffed, and so Carthage took the land back anyways. The Third Punic War was thus on, and Rome put Carthage under siege. That siege lasted 3 long years until Rome finally took the city. Carthage was famous for its defenses and multi-story apartment complexes. Some were as high as 6 stories high. And so, as the Roman soldiers waged a house-by-house, block-by-block street battle, trying to take the city, the Carthaginians pelted the Romans from above, traveling from house to house over the roofs, staying ahead of the Romans, and making them pay dearly for every inch of the city until it ultimately fell. The citizens were sold into slavery and the city demolished. The area was then incorporated into the Republic as the Roman province of Asia. Okay, with the story of Carthage's decline and downfall concluded, what did I build? Well, to continue our investigation into how Carthage changed over time, we're going to leave the area of Massouda and move forward up the hill to an area of the city named Byrsa. Byrsa is an area of the highest elevation in the city, and the name comes perhaps from the Greek word for leather. Recall in the last episode the story of the founding of Carthage and Dido having a hide of leather cut into a thin strip to encircle the whole of the city limits. It also might be that instead it comes from either a Semitic or an Akkadian word, which would either mean an escarpment or a fortress, which I think also logically makes sense given it being the highest hill in the city. On Byrsa Hill, there's a 2nd century BC housing district called the Hannibal District, after the Carthaginians' famous general, which we just talked about. So I built one of those houses from the excavated housing district on Block 4C. Similar to what I discussed in the last episode, while I recreated just one house, as you can see from the picture I'm putting up on screen, The houses in this district shared outer walls and lay within city streets that formed blocks within the city. There's a couple of things I want to point out in this recreation of the house on Block 4C. First, the construction's a little bit different from the previous houses from last episode. At this point in Carthage, construction had shifted over to using large square blocks of sandstone with rubble areas between them, which were plastered over, and some of the buildings in the district show that the stucco or plaster in different stages of being put in place, which I think is kind of cool. Some of the houses in the district were apartments, and they were multi-stories tall. The Roman historian named Appian wrote in his histories about the Carthaginians having apartment buildings that were 6 stories tall with shops on the first floor, which is a detail I mentioned previously coming into play during the Third Punic War. This house I recreated, though, seems to have just been a single story and had a central courtyard which contained a cistern. Last season of Archaeo SMP, I did an episode about Roman aqueducts and recreated one, and I talked about how Romans mostly used centralized fountains in their cities to provide water to their residents, but in Carthage, only a single fountain like that has been found during excavations. Instead, it seems that most houses had their own individual water collection cisterns. I'm popping up on screen again the picture of the excavations done in this district, and all those black oblong rectangles and circles are all individual cisterns for each house. The house had a long entrance corridor on the right side, which led into the house and had a little channel cut into the floor, perhaps to help remove wastewater. Often Carthaginian homes not only had their own cisterns, but also bathrooms and ways built in to remove wastewater. The floors in some areas of the houses contain mosaic tiles, so I chose to decorate the floors using these blocks here to replicate tiles. The rooms in this house were really pretty small, and from what I can tell is typical for houses of this era. Like the houses of last episode, I also built ladders up to the roof because the roof would be additional living spaces. And I think that's where we're maybe going to leave this episode. Last episode, we talked about early Carthage, and then in this episode, we continued to make our way through Carthaginian history and talked our way through the fall of Carthage at the hands of the Romans. After that destruction, Rome did eventually rebuild the city, with the area of Byrsa being the central forum for the Roman city of Carthage, and it continued to be inhabited and thrive all the way through until AD 700 or so. I put links, as always, to the articles and resources I used for this episode, so please check those out if you want to learn more. Thanks, have a good rest of your day. Bye for now.